Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in, well, one of the most complex, certainly disturbing, and ultimately, I think, defining criminal investigations of the last few years,
Yeah.
the 2022 University of Idaho murders.
Yeah, this case really did more than just capture national attention. It fundamentally shattered the sense of safety in Moscow, Idaho. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember, this was a small rural college town. They hadn't seen a murder since 2015.
Right.
So the suddenness, the sheer brutality
Uh,
of the mass stabbing of four young students,
mhm.
Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle, on November 13th, 2022,
Yeah,
it demanded this huge immediate response.
it truly did, and the complexity right from the start was just staggering. So our mission here in this deep dive, for you listening, is really to try and synthesize this incredibly dense stack of sources surrounding the tragedy. We're going to go step by step,
Okay.
focusing not just on the horror of the crime itself, which is undeniable, but also on the massive multi-agency investigation that unfolded. And, critically, the pivotal, sometimes controversial role of forensic genetic genealogy.
And eventually, the legal resolution, which, even though it concluded the case, kind of left this chilling question mark hanging over the killer's actual motive.
Yeah, exactly. And, for you, the listener, the sheer narrative arc here is what makes it such a compelling study. We start with a completely unsolved crime, a community terrified, students actually fleeing the campus.
Yeah, leaving early for the holidays because they just didn't feel safe.
And we follow this meticulous, often really frustrated investigation, all the twists and turns, leading eventually to the arrest of, well, a truly unlikely suspect, Brian Christopher Koberger.
A PhD student in criminology, no less, located right across the state line at Washington State University in Pullman, which is, what, less than 8 miles away?
Right across the border. Wow. The irony there. I mean, a doctoral student, someone dedicating their academic life to studying why crime happens, the roots of criminal behavior,
Yeah.
becoming the focus of this huge manhunt for mass murder. That paradox is something I think we really need to keep in mind as we unpack all this.
Absolutely. So let's start where we have to start, with the students, the lives that were cut short.
Yeah.
Because these weren't just names. They were vibrant, deeply connected young people. Madison Mogen, 21, she was a senior studying marketing, and Kaylee Goncalves, also 21, a general studies major.
That's friends, right, since childhood.
Exactly. Grew up together in Coeur d'Alene,
Yeah.
best friends. And Kaylee was apparently really driven. She was all set to graduate early that December, actually. Already had an IT job lined up down in Texas.
Just incredible potential lost.
Oh.
And then we have Xana Kernodle. She was 20, a junior, also in marketing. And her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, also 20. He was a sophomore studying recreation, sport, and tourism management.
And Ethan was just staying over that night. He wasn't a permanent resident of the house.
Right. And they were all really embedded in university life, weren't they? Sororities, fraternities.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Mogen and Kernodle were in Pi Beta Phi, Goncalves was in Alpha Phi, and Chapin was a Sigma Chi member. And, like a lot of students, they were balancing classes with work. Mogen and Kernodle both worked part-time at the Mad Greek restaurant there in Moscow. Popular spot.
So a really tight-knit group, busy lives.
Definitely.
Okay, let's talk about the setting, the off-campus house, because the layout is actually pretty crucial for understanding the timeline and, well, what happened later.
It really is. It was this 3-story rented house, kind of distinctively built into a hillside, which meant unusually it had outside entrances on both the first and second floors.
Right, I remember seeing pictures.
Yeah. And it was set up for communal living, 6 bedrooms total. Now, crucially for the events, the 3rd floor, the top floor, that's where Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves had their bedrooms.
And on that specific night.
They were actually sharing a single bed in Mogen's room. Apparently, Kaylee had recently moved out, getting ready for that Texas job, but she was back visiting Maddie, showing off her new car, I think the report said.
Okay, so they're together on the top floor, then the second floor.
That's where Xana Kernodle's room was, and also the room of one of the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen. And, of course, Xana's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, was staying over in her room that night.
Got it. And the other surviving roommate, Bethany Funk, her room was down on the first floor.
Correct. And sources are clear. All 6 people were back in that house by 2 a.m. Sunday morning.
Okay, so let's trace those final hours before things took that terrible turn, the timeline leading up to around 4 a.m.
Right. The investigators pieced this together pretty meticulously. Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle, they were the first ones back. Got home around 1:45 a.m., coming from a party at the Sigma Chi house.
And then Mogen and Goncalves arrived shortly after.
Yeah, just about 10 minutes later, 1:56 a.m. They'd been out downtown at the Corner Club bar, then stopped at the Grub Truck food truck. A pretty typical late Saturday night for college students.
But here's where it gets interesting and kind of chilling in retrospect. There's evidence not everyone went right to sleep. The phone records.
That's a key point. Between 2:26 a.m. and 2:52 a.m., so well after they got home, Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen made multiple phone calls. Unanswered calls, it turns out.
To who?
To Kaylee's former longtime boyfriend. Now, we don't know why they were calling, maybe just a late-night chat, maybe something else, but it definitely shows they were awake, interacting, well past 2 a.m. They weren't immediately asleep.
That detail. Yeah, it really shrinks the window for when they might have become vulnerable. Suddenly, the timeline feels much tighter.
Precisely. And based on all the forensic evidence, the audio recordings from nearby, investigators established this really narrow critical window for the attack itself, sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. Just 25 minutes.
And we know pretty definitively that at least one victim, Xana Kernodle, was awake right at the beginning of that window.
Absolutely. She received a DoorDash food delivery right around 4 a.m. And even more specifically, she was actively using the TikTok app on her phone at 4:12 a.m.
So she wasn't just stirring in her sleep. She was awake, engaged with her phone, literally minutes before the attack seems to have reached her floor.
That immediacy.
Yeah.
It leads us to probably the most difficult evidence to process. The account from the surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen. Her bedroom was right there on the second floor, same as Kernodle and Chapin.
What did she tell investigators?
She said she was woken up sometime after 4 a.m. by noises. Initially, she thought it was coming from the third floor, the top level, and she kind of dismissed it at first, thinking maybe it was Kaylee playing with her dog, Murphy, who was up there.
But the sounds, they changed. They became more alarming.
They did. She reported hearing someone say something like, "There's someone here." Now, initially, she thought maybe that was Kaylee's voice. But based on the timeline and knowing Xana was awake, investigators now strongly suspect that might actually have been Xana reacting to the intruder on her floor.
Chilling. And then it got worse.
Yeah. The auditory evidence gets more specific and more disturbing. Mortensen said she looked out her door after that first noise, didn't see anything. But then she heard what sounded clearly like crying, coming from Xana Kernodle's room.
Oh, God.
She opened her door a second time, and this time she heard something truly terrifying. An unfamiliar male voice, whispering, or maybe murmuring, a phrase like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you."
That's deeply unsettling. And there was external corroboration for this, right? From security cameras.
Yes, and this is where the timeline gets anchored forensically. Security cameras nearby picked up audio right around this time. Sounds described as whimpering, then a very loud thud, and then a dog, likely Murphy, upstairs, barking multiple times. All centered around 4:41 a.m.
Okay, so that aligns perfectly with what Mortensen was hearing. The attack seems to be unfolding right there on the second floor.
And then comes the moment Mortensen actually saw someone. She opened her door a third time, which you have to imagine the fear.
Unimaginable vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And she saw a figure, male, clad entirely in black clothing, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. And he walked right past her bedroom door.
Past her? Towards where?
Towards the back of the house on that second floor, heading for the sliding glass door in the kitchen area, which was one of the exits. She was adamant. She did not recognize him.
And her reaction.
She described it as being in the frozen shock phase, just complete paralysis, which is a very common trauma response. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Eventually, she managed to pull herself together enough to lock herself back inside her room.
So the killer walked within feet of her, and she survived. He exited, apparently, through that sliding door.
It seems so. Which leads us to the next really difficult part of this, the delay, the hours-long delay in calling the police.
Why didn't she call 911 immediately after seeing this masked figure?
According to what she later told investigators, it was a combination of factors. She stated she was intoxicated. Remember, they'd all been out, and that she just didn't want to believe what was going on. It sounds like shock, confusion, maybe denial took over.
So that decision, born out of trauma and maybe impairment, it meant the victims weren't discovered for hours.
Right. The timeline suggests she might have even gone downstairs briefly around 4:26 a.m., maybe after the figure left. She apparently saw Xana Kernodle lying on the floor, but didn't fully comprehend the situation, perhaps thinking she'd just passed out from drinking.
Oh, wow.
So she retreated. And then she and the other surviving roommate, Bethany Falcon from the first floor, they essentially locked themselves in Funke's room. And they spent the next several hours apparently trying to contact the others, maybe texting, calling their phones, still perhaps unable or unwilling to confront the horrific reality upstairs.
Until friends arrived much later that morning.
Yeah, it wasn't until just before noon. Friends came over, couldn't get anyone to answer. Eventually, someone went inside, and the true horror was discovered. The 911 call finally came in at 11:5542 a.m.
And even then, the initial report was for an unconscious person.
Right, which maybe suggests even the friends calling were still struggling to grasp the scene. Or maybe that was just the initial assessment relayed to the dispatcher.
The crime scene itself, the reports indicate an absolutely brutal level of violence.
Ferocious. The 4 victims were all stabbed multiple times. The weapon was identified as consistent with a large, military-style fixed-blade knife, something like a kabar.
And the location of the bodies.
Mogan and Goncalves were found together in that single bed in Mogan's third-floor room. Down on the second floor, Xana Kernodle was found on the floor of her bedroom. Ethan Chapin was found in the bed in that same room.
Were there any signs of sexual assault or restraint?
No, investigators were clear on that point. None of the victims were restrained, none were sexually assaulted. It suggests the motive was purely about the act of killing. Extreme violence.
And the extent of the injuries, some of the details are just horrific.
They are. Kaylee Goncalves, for instance. The autopsy reportedly found over 20 stab wounds, plus injuries consistent with asphyxiation and blunt force trauma. It points to a violent, prolonged struggle.
In Kernodle?
Even more telling, perhaps. Over 50 stab wounds reported for Xana Kernodle. And crucially, investigators noted numerous defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She fought back hard, right up until the very end.
That's incredibly brave and incredibly tragic. And what about the dog, Kaylee's dog, Murphy?
That's one of the lingering, slightly strange details. The dog was found alive on the 3rd floor, unharmed. In the middle of all that carnage, the killer apparently left the animal completely untouched.
Which maybe speaks to a very specific focus on the human victims?
Perhaps. Or maybe just the chaos of the moment. It's hard to say. But when the news finally broke, when the discovery was made public, the reaction in Moscow was immediate and overwhelming.
Yeah, it led to this profound community crisis, didn't it? The university canceled classes almost immediately.
The atmosphere just turned to sheer terror. Students were genuinely afraid for their lives. You had this mass exodus students leaving Moscow early for the Thanksgiving holiday, just fleeing. They felt like there was an active killer hunting students.
And the initial police response didn't exactly help calm fears, did it?
No, it arguably made it worse initially. On the day of the murders, the Moscow Police Department put out statements trying to reassure people, saying there was no ongoing risk to the community, implying maybe it was targeted or the threat was gone.
But they had to walk that back pretty quickly.
They did. Just 3 days later, Police Chief James Fry had to stand up and say, "We cannot say that there is no threat to the community." That complete reversal from "you're safe" to, well, actually, maybe you're not. It just confirmed everyone's worst fears. Anxiety levels shot through the roof.
And that feeds right into what became a huge problem, the information management crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. You had intense frustration building, especially from the victims' families. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, and Jim Chapin, Ethan's father, became very vocal. They publicly criticized the police, the university, basically saying they weren't getting enough information. They felt stonewalled while their children's killer was still out there.
And on top of that, you had misleading information muddying the waters. That stalker theory.
Right. Police got a tip early on that Kaylee Goncalves supposedly had a stalker. The media jumped all over it. It became this major public theory about motive, about who might be responsible.
But it went nowhere.
Completely nowhere. Investigators chased it down, of course, but it was ultimately determined to be a false lead. It had nothing to do with the case against Koberger. But it shows you the kind of dead ends they were dealing with, fueled by public speculation.
And speaking of speculation, the whole internet sleuths phenomenon really exploded with this case, didn't it?
Oh, it was unprecedented. You had TikTokers, YouTubers, self-proclaimed psychics, armchair detectives, all jumping in, spreading rumors, pointing fingers, generating just tons of misinformation online.
How did that impact the actual investigation?
It became a massive operational headache. The Moscow Police Department literally had to assign officers just to track and debunk the wildest rumors. They put out statements calling it a huge distraction, saying it was actively compromising the investigation because it was wasting valuable time and resources.
And it got pretty ugly, too, people being targeted online.
Yeah, it did. It got to the point where the police had to issue warnings. If you harass or threaten people being named in these online rumors, people who often had zero connection to the case, you could face criminal charges yourself. The sheer volume of digital noise was just overwhelming.
So, okay, you've got this backdrop. Intense community fear, pressure from families, this constant online chaos. How did law enforcement actually move forward?
Well, it required this huge coordinated effort. The Moscow PD led, but they had critical support from the Idaho State Police, the ISP, and very importantly, the FBI. At its peak, nearly 130 law enforcement personnel were working this case full-time, sifting through, get this, over 15,000 tips from the public.
15,000, wow. Where did the breakthrough finally come from?
It really pivoted on two key strands of evidence that eventually intertwined, identifying that suspect vehicle, the ghost car, and then the huge DNA breakthrough.
Let's start with the car, the white Hyundai Elantra.
Right. Early on, investigators were scouring surveillance video from the neighborhood around the King Road house, and they spotted it. A white or maybe light-colored sedan.
Doing what?
Driving past the house multiple times in the hour leading up to the murders. It first shows up around 3:29 a.m., passes by 3 times. Then it comes back a 4th time, right at 4:04 a.m., aligning perfectly with the start of that attack window.
And then it's seen leaving.
Exactly. Speeding away from the area at 4:20 a.m., just as the attack window closes. Based on the look of the car and those grainy videos, police initially put out a BLO B on the loomed. On the lookout for white Hyundai Elantras, specifically model years 2011 to 2013.
That's a lot of cars. How many were they looking at?
The estimate was around 22,000 vehicles, just matching that initial description. A massive haystack to search through.
And was the description even accurate in the end?
It was close, but slightly off. Koberger's car was a white Elantra, but it turned out to be a slightly later model year, 2015, I believe. That small discrepancy highlights just how vital the next piece of evidence was, the digital trail, in pinpointing the specific vehicle and its owner.
Okay, so the cell phone data. This seems to be where things really started to focus on Koberger.
Absolutely. This data didn't just place a white Elantra near the scene. It potentially placed Koberger's phone there and suggested planning.
How so?
First key observation. His phone stopped connecting to the cell network in Pullman, Washington, where he lived and went to school, at 2:47 a.m. that morning. That's over an hour before the murders began.
Suggesting
The phone might have been deliberately turned off or put in airplane mode, a potential attempt to avoid being tracked during the drive over to Moscow and during the crime itself. It only pinged the network again at 4:48 a.m., but this time near Blaine, Idaho, which is south of Moscow, consistent with a return route towards Pullman.
Okay, a blackout is suspicious, but maybe not conclusive on its own. What else did they find?
The 9 a.m. ping, this was crucial. At 9 o'clock that same morning, so about 5 hours after the murders, Koberger's phone pinged the cell tower that provides service to the immediate area around the victim's house on King Road.
So he came back, or drove by again?
That's the strong implication. Being in that specific location 5 hours later, not during a normal commute time, it looked highly suspicious. It suggested maybe he returned to the scene or was circling the area again.
But the real clincher was the historical data, right? The earlier pings.
Exactly. That's what really blew the case open from the cell data perspective. Investigators pulled his historical cell records, and they found that Koberger's phone had connected to that same specific cell tower nearest the King Road house at least 12 times in the months before the murders.
12 times. Starting when?
Between June 2022 and November 13th, the day of the killings. That pattern completely undercut any argument that his presence near the house on the night of the murder, or even that morning, was just random chance or coincidence.
It paints a picture of surveillance. Or planning.
Precisely. It suggested he was potentially casing the location, monitoring the residents' patterns, or maybe even practicing the route multiple times over several months. It demonstrated premeditation and a specific targeted interest in that house.
Okay. So the cell data provides this pattern of suspicious behavior, linking him geographically and temporally. But the physical evidence, the DNA, that's what tied him directly to the inside of the house.
That was the final, definitive piece. And it came from that tan leather knife sheath, the one found lying on the bed on the 3rd floor, right next to Madison Mogen's body.
They got DNA from that sheath.
Yes. A single source of male DNA was recovered from the button snap of the sheath. They ran it through CODIS, the National Database of Known Offenders and Arrestees. No match. The DNA profile didn't hit on anyone in the system.
So that's when they pivot to genetic genealogy.
Exactly. When CODIS came up empty, the investigation turned to forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG. This is where they take that unknown DNA profile and upload it to public consumer genealogy databases, sites like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, though usually accessed through intermediary sites like GED Match or Family Tree DNA that allow law enforcement uploads under certain conditions.
To find relatives.
To find distant relatives of the unknown contributor, people who have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA profiles. The goal is to build out family trees from those matches, and through genealogical research, eventually narrow it down to a single potential suspect.
Who did they work with initially?
They first partnered with Othram, a private lab specializing in FGG. Othram processed the sample and found a match, someone who shared 70.7 centimorgans, or cm, of DNA with the profile from the sheath.
Okay, 70.7 centimere. What does that mean in terms of relationship? How close is that?
It's fairly distant. Think maybe a third cousin or possibly someone sharing a great-great-grandparent. It gives investigators a potential family line to investigate, maybe some surnames, but it still requires a huge amount of traditional genealogical work to pinpoint the actual person. It could still be hundreds or even thousands of people in that family tree.
So a lead, but not a direct hit. And
Yeah.
then things got controversial.
Yeah, this is where it gets murky and legally questionable. According to reports, Othram was asked to pause its work. The FBI then took the lead on the genealogy part, and they apparently used methods that went against the Department of Justice's own policies at the time. The DOJ policy required investigators to use only those genealogy databases that gave explicit notice to their users that law enforcement might use their data. Many consumer sites either didn't have this notice or required users to specifically opt in to law enforcement matching or needed a warrant. The FBI allegedly used sites like GED Match and MyHeritage, potentially bypassing these restrictions or using databases users hadn't consented to for this purpose.
So they broke policy, but did it work? Did they get a closer match?
They did. This more aggressive, arguably improper search quickly yielded a much closer relative, someone sharing about 250 centimorgans with the sheath DNA.
And 250 centiam is significantly closer.
Oh, much closer. That's more in the range of a second cousin. That level of match allows genealogists to zero in on a suspect much, much faster. And that's exactly what happened. They were able to trace that family tree directly to Brian Koberger.
That's when they started watching him.
Yes. Once genealogy pointed squarely at Koberger, law enforcement began intense surveillance on him. He'd driven home to Pennsylvania for the holidays with his father by this point. So FBI agents and Pennsylvania State Police started watching him at his parents' house in Albrightsville, Monroe County.
What did they observe during that surveillance?
His behavior only deepened their suspicions. He was seen multiple times wearing surgical gloves, even when doing mundane things outside. And most notably, he was seen meticulously cleaning his white Hyundai Elantra.
How meticulous.
The reports described it as inside and outside, not missing an inch. It suggested someone deeply paranoid about leaving behind any trace evidence, hair, fibers, DNA.
And this obsessive cleaning actually helped them.
Ironically, yes, because at one point investigators saw him take trash bags from his family's home and put them in a neighbor's garbage bin, presumably for pickup.
Which allowed the police to collect it.
Exactly. Once the trash was out on the curb in the neighbor's bin, it's considered abandoned property. Police could legally seize it without a warrant. They recovered items from that trash, got a DNA sample likely from Koberger or a close family member like his father, and rushed it for comparison.
And it matched the sheath DNA.
It was a match. Specifically, they established a direct father-son relationship between the DNA from the trash and the DNA on the knife sheath. That was the final piece they needed for probable cause. It confirmed Brian Koberger was overwhelmingly likely the source of the DNA left at the crime scene.
Which led directly to the arrest, December 30th, 2022.
Right. Early that morning, the Pennsylvania State Police Special Emergency Response Team, the CERT team, along with the FBI, executed the arrest warrant at his parents' home.
And the details of the arrest itself were also strange.
They were. They found Koberger in the kitchen around 1:0 or 2 a.m. He was apparently awake, dressed just in shorts and a shirt, but he was wearing examination gloves. And he was in the process of sorting trash into separate individual Ziploc baggies.
Even as he was being arrested.
According to the reports, yes. It speaks volumes about his mindset, maybe his knowledge of forensic evidence collection, and this almost obsessive need to control his environment and prevent leaving traces.
And the search of the house and his belongings turned up more evidence.
It did. During the search subsequent to his arrest, they found items including a knife, a Glock .40 repeatal caliber pistol, black face masks, dark clothing, And significantly, his driver's license and other ID cards hidden inside a glove that was stuffed in a box.
Items consistent with the crime scene description and Mortenson's observation.
Precisely. It all started to form a cohesive picture, linking the digital evidence, the DNA, the surveillance observations, and now the physical items found in his possession.
So this brings us squarely to Brian Christopher Kohberger, not just a suspect, but a PhD student of criminology.
The irony just hangs over this entire case, doesn't it? Born in 1994, he'd pursued academics focused almost entirely on crime and the mind. He got his associate's, bachelor's, and master's degrees in psychology and criminal justice from DeSales University between 2018 and 2022.
And then he started his PhD at Washington State University, right near Moscow.
Yeah, he began the doctoral program in criminology at WSU in Pullman in the summer of 2022, just a few months before the murders. He had just finished his first semester there as both a student and a teaching assistant when the killings occurred.
Were there any warning signs from his academic life? Anything that surfaced later?
There were. Sources revealed that faculty at WSU had actually met with Kohberger before the murders in early November 2022 to discuss concerns about his behavior. Specifically, complaints regarding his interactions with female students in his role as a teaching assistant.
So professional conduct issues already existed?
Yes, and these issues apparently continued because he was formally terminated from his TA position on December 19, 2022. This was before his arrest, mind you, citing unprofessional conduct and not meeting the expectations of the role.
Interesting. Now, his defense later brought up some potential mitigating factors related to his mental state.
They did. His defense team indicated they might present evidence that Kohberger had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They suggested this might help explain some of his social interactions or behaviors.
How did the court respond to that?
The judge seemed somewhat skeptical, or at least cautious. He noted that Kohberger appeared, quote, by all accounts highly functioning during court proceedings and didn't exhibit obvious signs. The judge indicated that expert testimony on the autism diagnosis might only be allowed if Kohberger himself chose to testify, which he ultimately did not.
And there were other mentions of personal struggles, things he wrote about online.
Yeah, some of his earlier online writings surfaced where he apparently discussed dealing with long-term mental health challenges. Specifically, he mentioned suffering from tinnitus, that constant ringing in the ears, and also something called visual snow syndrome, which causes persistent static-like dots in one's vision.
So it paints a picture of someone potentially grappling with internal issues alongside the academic focus on crime.
It adds layers, certainly. It suggests a more complex individual than perhaps initially perceived.
Before we get to the legal endgame, there's one more detail connecting him to the area, driving that Elantra, months before the murders.
Ah, right. The traffic stop. This happened back in August 2022, about 3 months before the killings. A Leda County Sheriff's deputy pulled Kohberger over for speeding on the highway between Pullman and Moscow.
In the white Elantra?
Yes, body cam footage confirmed it was the same white Hyundai Elantra later identified leaving the crime scene. But at the time, the deputy just gave him a warning for speeding and ended up issuing a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt. Kohberger drove away. Just a routine stop at the time, but chilling in retrospect.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move to the legal proceedings after his arrest and extradition back to Idaho.
He was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim, and 1 count of felony burglary for entering the house with intent to commit murder.
And the arraignment. That didn't go smoothly.
No, it hit a procedural bump. When he was arraigned in Leta County District Court in May 2023, Kohberger refused to enter a plea himself. His defense attorney said he was standing silent.
What does that mean legally, standing silent?
It essentially means the defendant refuses to say guilty or not guilty. In such cases, the judge is required by law to enter a plea on their behalf to allow the case to proceed. So the judge entered a plea of not guilty for Kohberger on all charges.
And the prosecution's stance on the penalty?
Given the nature of the crime for victims, the brutality, the Leta County prosecutor, Bill Thompson, announced pretty quickly in June 2023 that his office would be seeking the death penalty. They cited the statutory aggravating circumstances required for capital punishment in Idaho.
That obviously raises the stakes significantly. Did the venue become an issue?
It absolutely did. Kohberger's defense team filed a motion for a change of venue, arguing that the sheer volume of pretrial publicity, the intense local media coverage, and the deep community connection to the case in Leta County made it impossible for him to get a fair trial there.
And the judge agreed.
Yes. In September 2024, the judge granted the motion. He agreed that the publicity had likely created presumed prejudice. The trial was ordered to be moved out of Ada County all the way down to Boise in Ada County, hundreds of miles south.
So the trial was set for Boise, potentially in August 2025, but it never actually happened.
Correct. Just as everyone was gearing up for what was expected to be a long, complex, and highly publicized trial, there was a major development. On July 2nd, 2025, Brian Kohberger unexpectedly changed his plea.
He pleaded guilty.
He pleaded guilty to all 5 charges, the 4 counts of first-degree murder and the felony burglary charge.
Why the sudden change? Was it a deal?
It was absolutely a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to all charges, the prosecution agreed to take the death penalty off the table. A critical part of that deal was that Kohberger also waived all his rights to future appeals.
So the conviction and sentence would be final, immediately.
Exactly. That waiver of appeals was likely a key factor for the prosecution and the victims' families, guaranteeing closure and avoiding potentially decades of death penalty appeals.
But this plea deal, it means we never really got an official explanation, a motive presented in court, right?
That's the lingering question. The sources are clear. Despite the guilty plea and conviction, the official motive for why Brian Kohberger committed these horrific murders remains unknown. He never offered an explanation as part of the plea agreement, and the prosecution wasn't required to prove motive to secure the conviction under the deal.
So the why remains elusive, officially at least.
It does. For the prosecution, securing those guaranteed life sentences without parole, providing that finality for the families, likely outweighed the need to definitively establish a motive in a trial setting, especially with the risks inherent in any trial.
And the sentencing followed soon after the plea.
Yes. Just 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, the judge formally imposed the sentence agreed upon in the plea deal.
Which was
4 consecutive life sentences in prison, without the possibility of parole, 1 for each murder victim, plus an additional 10 years served consecutively for the burglary charge. He was also ordered to pay about $270,000 in fines and restitution.
So the maximum possible sentence, short of execution, a definitive end to the legal chapter.
Yes, legally the case was closed, but for the community, for the university, the process of healing and remembering was and still is ongoing.
The house itself, that became a focal point, didn't it?
It really did, a source of morbid curiosity, a painful reminder. The owner eventually donated the house on King Road to the University of Idaho, and the university made the decision quite quickly, actually, to demolish it.
When did that happen?
It was torn down about 10 months after the murders in December 2023. It was seen as a necessary step, really, to remove that physical scar from the community and allow people to start moving forward without that constant visual reminder.
And the university has done other things to memorialize the students.
Yes, significantly. In 2024, they dedicated the Vandal Healing Garden and Memorial on campus. It's intended as a permanent space for reflection, for remembering not just these 4 students, but any members of the university community lost too soon.
And scholarships, too, I believe.
That's right. The university established scholarships in the names of Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Madison Mogan, tying their legacies to helping future students achieve their own educational dreams.
And in a very emotional gesture, they awarded degrees posthumously.
They did. At the spring commencement ceremony in May 2023, the university awarded degrees posthumously to all 4 victims, Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, acknowledging the academic work they had completed and the futures that were tragically stolen.
This case also very quickly became part of the sort of true crime cultural landscape, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The media attention was intense from day one and continued right through the legal proceedings. For instance, Amazon Prime Video released a multi-part documentary series called One Night in Idaho, The College Murders in June 2025.
Just before the plea deal was announced?
Yeah, literally just weeks before Kohberger pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
It shows just how much public fascination there was and continues to be with understanding the details of the investigation, the whole story of this case.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, looking back at everything this quiet town shattered, the chaotic investigation hampered by digital noise, the breakthrough via controversial technology, and finally this legal resolution without a stated motive. What's the big question that lingers?
I think for me, and maybe for you listening too, it really comes back to that genetic genealogy piece, specifically the way the FBI ultimately got the identifying match.
Using those consumer databases against DOJ policy at the time.
Exactly. Given that reliance on accessing sensitive, personal genetic data submitted by consumers, often without their explicit consent for law enforcement use, It forces us to confront a really fundamental question about privacy versus public safety.
That is the provocative thought, isn't it? Where do we draw the line? What boundaries should law enforcement respect when it comes to accessing our most personal information, our DNA profiles held by private companies?
Even when the goal is bringing justice for a crime as horrific as this one, what are the ethical guardrails? When you upload your DNA to find distant cousins, are you implicitly consenting to potentially helping solve cold cases or even implicating relatives in future crimes?
It's a huge societal question, especially as the technology just keeps advancing, often faster than our laws or ethical frameworks can keep up.
Absolutely. That tension between the power of this technology to solve crimes and the potential erosion of genetic privacy, that's something that this case starkly highlights, and something we'll all be grappling with for years to come. Definitely something worth thinking more about on your own.
A deeply complex case raising incredibly important questions for the future. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.